This video is part 4 of Chapter 5 Memory for PSY 110S, the Psychological Sciences. So far we've talked about the various stages of memory, including the sensory registers, the short-term memory, long-term memory. We've also talked about levels of processing. In this final section of the chapter, we're going to talk about forgetting. Ebbinghaus conducted some of the first experiments in human memory over a century ago, and also talked about and investigated the relearning method. He did little demonstrations, small experiments looking at relearned lists of nonsense syllables, because he didn't want to have the impact of learned language be an intervening variable. So he used these nonsense syllables, collections of letters that don't spell words, and computed what he called a saving score. So he would study, he did it himself, he also had other people do it. He would study a list of nonsense syllables until he could correctly recite the whole list without hesitations. Then he would put the list aside. So just like I talked about in the last section, he would put the list aside, then he would relearn the list, and he would measure what he called a saving score. So what did he still recall, and how much more quickly could he show that he could relearn the material. So to get a measure of learning, he would compute the reduction in the number of trials it took him to reach his criterion. And that's what he called the saving score. Eventually, what he was able to document was something called a forgetting curve, which reveals the most forgetting occurs in those first couple of days after learning new material, and then it kind of levels off and plateaus after that. So this is a visual representation of the forgetting curve that Ebbinghaus was able to demonstrate, and it's been documented in research since that time and is pretty stable. So what this shows is that over the course of long-term forgetting, most of the forgetting happens within the first few days. Then you get a little, or the first couple of days, and then you get a little further drop in retention. Then it levels off across that span of days since learning the original list. So this is referred to as, the Ebbinghaus forgetting curve. What this shows, and when he was doing the saving score, what he was able to show is that if you distribute your learning over time, and you engage in repeated, spaced out relearning, you can combat that forgetting within the first couple of days. A lot of students talk about how after they study really, really hard for an exam, they take the exam, and then they're often surprised by the fact that, 2 weeks later, they remember very little of what they studied. And that's because of that failure to engage in relearning over time that can preserve that memory. So what he's really showing here is you can get yourself to criterion memorizing new material that's unrelated to old learning. And you can show that without relearning, you're going to lose that information fairly rapidly. If you want material to stay very stable, you have to revisit it on a regular basis, or it's going to decay over time. Now, there are a number of theories explaining forgetting and why we have that sort of loss of information that even was well learned on the first pass. Some material is forgotten because it's not encoded fully or not encoded deeply into long-term memory. This is why when students really, hammer away at material right in front of an exam, lots of intense learning, they may take the test and even do very well on the test, but then weeks later, they let's say you have a professor who does a comprehensive exam, they're surprised by the fact that they do not remember and have to kind of start over learning that material again when they're going to be tested over it at a later point in time. That some of that is due to encoding failure. So one theory is that forgetting is due to a failure to fully encode the information into long-term memory. But there's also a storage decay theory that can explain the same phenomenon, where students study material very hard and they get themselves to the place where they can perform very well, but then they don't revisit that material immediately afterwards. That can lead to decay. So both theories have merit and feel accurate. There's also another theory called cue-dependent theory, and that suggests that people forget because the cues that were present at the time of learning are no longer present, and that makes retrieval difficult because it was dependent on those particular cues. Finally, there's something called interference theory, and interference theory argues that when you're trying to learn similar information, for instance, if you're learning Spanish and French at the same time, you could get some interferences where you're trying to learn one piece of information or a set of information, and your learning of another block of information is getting in the way and creating confusability. That can then make some of the information inaccessible, or it can lead to mistakes where you're overlapping information. With interference theory, there are a couple of different forms of interference that can be problematic. You can have something called proactive interference, where information that you already know is interfering with your ability to retrieve new information. And it's not necessarily because of the new information being completely inconsistent with the old information. Your authors give you the example of changing your phone number. I can still remember my childhood landline number from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And for a while, I had a phone number that was similar with just some reversed numbers, some reversed digits. And when I got that new phone number, I was persistently telling people the wrong number because my new number had 2 digits reversed from my childhood home number. I have the same problem now with my cell phone number. It has some overlap with my office phone number. So the new cell phone number that I got several years ago being so similar to my office phone number, that created some proactive interference. Information that I already had, my office phone number, was interfering with my ability to learn the new number when I got my first cell phone. There's also something called retroactive interference, and this happens when information you just newly learned interferes with your ability to retrieve the old information. So here, your authors give you the example of being at a party with lots of people you don't know. You're meeting someone you want to talk to later, but after meeting that person, you're introduced to many more people. That happens to lots of people when you're expected to meet a whole bunch of people, but and all of those new names, every time you are introduced to someone new, it interferes with your ability to remember the first people you met. So that is retroactive interference. Now, your authors also give you the example of studying French and Spanish, and they give you examples of both types of interference. So if you study French in high school and then you switch to studying Spanish in college, you could have some proactive interference where the information that you already knew about French can leak into your attempts to study Spanish when you're taking that Spanish test. So that can be, a challenge. You can also have retroactive interference where you're studying Spanish and you're taking that new information. If you then tried to pick up French again at the same time when you are studying Spanish, attempting to retrieve that old French material from your long-term memory can be interfered with by your newly learned information about Spanish. Now, I mentioned earlier in this chapter that memory is essentially reconstructive in nature. It's not like pushing the play button on a video. You literally are, every time you pull information out of your memory, especially when we're talking about episodic memories, as opposed to declarative information where there are facts that you can check, when you're recounting stories about your life, about your experiences, every time you go and revisit that information and then tell the story again, you are reconstructing your experience of that event. And every time you do it, it will feel authentic. It'll feel completely real. Retrieval, essentially, if you think about this construct called a schema, we have as a part of our memory system, as a part of our understanding of ourselves as living people, we have these schematic representations that are supposed to help us as a shortcut for understanding certain kinds of social interactions. So, for example, Americans have a birthday party schema for childhood birthdays. And since we have that schema for what a childhood birthday party might look like, that influences the way we recall our own episodes of childhood birthdays. And we kind of mix our schematic representation of what those events should be like with what our actual experiences of our own birthdays might have felt like going forward. And then if you add to that certain sort of retrieval cues, like the stories other people tell about the same events, or photographs or video recordings of those same events, then we can sort of feel the fully reconstructive nature of long-term memory, and especially episodic memory. So schemas are essentially frameworks that help us to understand how certain kinds of people are supposed to behave, how they're supposed to look, how they're supposed to sound, and so on, what certain objects look like, what they're for, and what kind of certain kinds of events are supposed to be like. So, for example, someone asked me recently, what is your most favorite rock concert that you've ever been to? And that's an easy one. It was when I saw Peter Gabriel in the 80s with some of my high school friends. I believe I was in my first year of college at the time, but yeah. So we go to the concert. It's at Blossom Music Center, and we sat on the lawn. This is when they still let you bring your own food and sit on the lawn at Blossom. And we sat on a blanket, and we were pretty far away, but it was still amazing. And, I can tell stories about it, and but I have very limited specific recollections that are in part mixed with the fact that I also saw a concert film from the same tour. So, but I have schemas for rock concerts because I've been to a lot of them. What will happen if I tell the story of the Peter Gabriel concert to another person, it will be necessarily a mixture of the concert schema in my memory, other concert experiences that I've had, my friend's retelling of the same event, and the concert video, the movie that I saw. So these holistically, when we pull up a long-term memory, it'll feel real. But the fact of the matter is, we tend to encode into long-term episodic memory a lot of the feeling, the tone, a handful of really specific experiences. Like I have this very vivid memory of my best high school friend talking about the moment that Peter Gabriel would have during this particular tour of letting himself laying out across the crowd and being kind of walked around in the crowd. And she said in her best 19-year-old voice, "Don't hurt him." So I have this very specific memory of that. But the rest of the night is just a blur of happiness and joy and enjoyment of the music. Ask me about specific songs. Since it was the tour for So, I can probably guess which ones were played, but I might be wrong, because memory is not literal. It is story. So we hit the high notes and we have memories for those high notes, but we have to weave them together so they make a coherent whole. Schemas allow us to do that fairly efficiently, while we're pulling together those nuggets of things we actually remember. So what can happen is that people will misremember information, not because they're lying, but because they are using this schematic system to weave together something that feels very coherent and matches with who we are at the moment when we're telling the story. Another example would be if you're reading a newspaper article, you're usually going to encode the high points, the gist, the main theme, and how it made you feel. When you retrieve it, you're not going to be able to give a literal recounting. So I was telling my husband a story yesterday about something I saw on TikTok, where Snoop Dogg, the rapper, was giving play-by-play at a Milwaukee Brewers game, and how funny it was. Now, I couldn't quote word for word things that Snoop Dogg said. What I could remember vividly was it made me laugh really hard, the way he was talking about the players and what they were doing, and how there's this stolen base, and how he called, how he referred to the runner, the Brewers player, as, "Oh, look at him showing up for his uncle," and it's not his nephew. But how funny that was. So I may get tiny details wrong. I can't quote it word for word because I don't have time to do that, but I remember how funny it was. So when we retrieve the information, we're reconstructing the story using the theme and the highlights. So that can lead us to misremember, not because we're lying, not because we're stupid, but because you're recording what's important about the story. And a lot of that has to do with how it made you feel. Now, there are a couple of different ways in which we have vulnerabilities, because that's the way our memory systems work. Since memory, especially long-term episodic memory, is reconstructive, we are vulnerable to making misattributions, and we're vulnerable to misinformation. These sorts of things happen when we don't remember the true source of a memory, and we may misattribute that memory to the wrong source. So misattribution happens when we do that. So you may have heard this, some piece of information and think it is real news, when in fact it may have been a TikTok story, or it may have been something you saw on YouTube. And you feel like it's really legitimate information, but you're misattributing the source to a legitimate news organization. That happens a lot, where people assume that because something looks like a news story, it's a news story, but we're misattributing the real source of that information. What this can do is create false elements to the memories that we believe are real. So they can create inaccuracies in memories they feel real, they feel accurate, but making misattributions of source and then weaving in misinformation and recalling it inaccurately can feel like the memory was absolutely true. For example, my mother is convinced that the granddaughter of a friend of hers, now take this for what it is. My mother, God love her, is 85 years old. So she believes 100% that the granddaughter of a friend of hers, who is a teacher at a school in the South, was required, or there was some discussion of being required to have litter boxes for children who identify as cats. And this was an internet story that had all kinds of conversation about it. It was cited by conservative media as an example of wokeism gone way too far, and so on. And it had been widely debunked that it was false information, it was misinformation that was transmitted through social media, through YouTube, through Facebook, and so on. And what my mother remembers is her friend saying, "My granddaughter said in her school." That's not what happened. What happened was that her friend had reported that she had seen this story, this news story, and was worried that her granddaughter would be required to do this bizarre thing. And I told my mother, and even showed her the fact-checking on these stories, that they were actually false, that there has never been actual credible evidence that any school system in the United States has been pressured or required to have litter boxes for children identifying as cats, that this was a structure that was misinformation that was flowing through conservative media just to create havoc, because that's what they're good at. So the way my mother encoded this story essentially became a false memory, and we've gone back to this discussion many times, because to her it feels really real that this actually happened. And I'm like, no, it's a false memory. I've debunked this for you more than once. Just stop it. But exposures to misleading information can result in distortions of memory. And that's why, some of the trends that have happened in politics in recent years are so disturbing, that once you put false information out into that social media landscape, it can be very persuasive, very sticky. Just like my mother's recounting of this story of litter boxes in grade schools for cat identifying humans, which never happened, but it's sticky. It's very memorable, it's vivid, and it's hard to get people to let go of it. Other kinds of false memories that are a bit more experimentally validated involves research that has shown that depending on the way people are questioned, you can create what's called a misinformation effect. And this is when a memory can be distorted by the way questions are asked. So some of the research that was described for you in your textbook has to do with how, when people witness, say, a car crash, the type of words that someone asking questions of that witness uses can influence facts that the person reports. So if you use words like crash as opposed to hit, crash tends to feel like the person driving the car that crashed into another car was driving faster than if they just hit the car. Words like smash, crash, tend to feel like, more intense than just words like hit or bump. So the words used during questioning of witnesses can mislead them and lead them to report things that didn't actually occur. Like if not only do people estimate if you use words like crash or smash, they not only believe that the car in a car accident was going faster, they also misremember seeing broken glass that was never in the video that they saw. So what this can suggest is that you have to be very, very careful when interviewing eyewitnesses and eliciting their testimony, that the words that were used, the method of questioning, can lead to misremembering and augmented memories that feel very real to the witness and therefore can look very real when reported to a jury. So eyewitness testimony is very subject to error, and we know this based on experimental research, but also, just looking at the record in the criminal justice system as well, that eyewitness testimony is very vulnerable to misinformation effects and to manipulation. So it also goes into these cases where so-called recovered memories are very, very vulnerable. So if you take a person, for instance, who suffered childhood trauma of some kind, if that person is questioned in a particularly leading way, that person can misremember information about that trauma that never actually occurred, and it can feel very real to the person. Now, the notorious cases that are related to this have to do with the eliciting of false memories of childhood sexual abuse. This is very, very controversial, difficult information. So what had happened in the late 80s, early 90s, was that there was a flurry of cases of so-called recovered memories of early childhood sexual abuse at the hands of parents and caregivers. It wasn't like thousands of cases. It was a small number of cases, but there was a lot of press attention given to them. And at first, what appeared to be solid recollections of horrific abuse by parents and caregivers became much more convoluted when memory researchers started to look harder at the way in which these memories had been elicited. So you had people who were psychologically troubled. So these were people who had PTSD-like symptoms. They were seeing therapists, and when they were seeing these therapists, what was found was that some of these therapists were using very leading questions when they were talking to their clients, leading them in the direction very strongly of recovering memories of previous childhood abuse. And some of these therapists, psychiatrists, were incredibly unethical in the approach that they were taking. And they were using leading question strategies that led these very vulnerable people to structure based on schemas that were heavily in the media at the time of childhood sexual abuse. A handful of these cases were debunked, meaning that it was shown through the evidence that the abuse that was alleged never happened. And there were a small number of cases where people were falsely accused and even imprisoned as a result of these kinds of false memory generations. Now, I want to emphasize that this was a relatively small number of cases. It's fairly difficult to implant fully formed false memories, and the overwhelming majority of people who report that they were sexually abused as children by their caregivers are not recovering those memories. They never forgot them. They are fully aware or well aware of the fact that they were traumatized as children, and in what way. So we're not talking about just saying all people who say that they were molested by family members or caregivers are making it up, or they've been manipulated by therapists. Most people who have been traumatized know that they've been traumatized, and they don't have to recover hidden memories. What happened, though, in the late 80s and the 90s, there was this uptick in reported cases of recovered memory, and some of those can be tied directly back to the misbehavior of mental health providers who were using techniques with vulnerable people that led to false memories. So I'm trying to be very, very careful in describing what occurred there. It just shows, in the research of people like those described in your textbook, where you have very clearly, under highly controlled circumstances, you can lead people to believe something happened that didn't happen. More likely, and somewhat easier to accomplish, is embellishments. So layering on facts that never occurred to the scaffold of an already existing story, that's easier to do. But what we should all be aware of is that our memories are highly reconstructive, and we should be on alert for the ways in which our memories can be manipulated when we are asked to recount them. And that concludes my coverage of Chapter 5.